William the Silent, Chapter 1, Birth and Boyhood. The ruined castle of Dillenburg in Nassau stands on a gigantic mound above the Dill, a tributary of the Lahn which, in its turn, joins the Rhine a few miles above Koblenz. The river winds half round the rock, and under its shadow lies a quiet little town of a few thousand inhabitants. Unpretentious churches, unpretentious schools, little narrow streets of archaic houses. For leagues in every direction, the country is gently undulating, well sprinkled with trees, fertile of corn and vine. There has been little alteration since the 16th century, but the castle, now no more than a few gaunt walls, blackened by fire and siege, was 400 years ago one of the stateliest and least pregnable in Germany. Built about 1250 by Henry, grandson of Rupert of Nassau, and a man with an eye for a military position, it became the hereditary headquarters of the younger of the two great Nassau lines. The family was sufficiently fashionable to be turbulent, and its stronghold saw numberless attacks. But it resisted them all successfully, and gradually houses began to cluster around its foot, a small wooden brood under a colossal stone bird. Before the 15th century was out, the town had achieved importance enough to be granted city privileges and the establishment of a law court under the jurisdiction of John II of the Helmet increased the prestige of both castle and occupants. That prince's great-nephew, John V, supplemented the law court with a church and a school, set up more courts in other parts of the county, and started a mining industry. By the middle of the 16th century, Dillenburg was, as small German cities of those days went, a place of note and wealth, and its castle one of the most celebrated baronial homes in the empire. There, on the 25th of April, 1533, Juliana of Stolberg bore to her husband William the Rich of Nassau, a son, William, who was destined to shed on the Nassau name, a brighter and more permanent glory than any it had hitherto acquired. Yet already the family history was no undistinguished one. The Nassaus had played an important part in the history of the empire and of Europe. Historians with axes to grind traced their origin, enviable or otherwise, to one of Caesar's officers, to an uncle of Emperor Severus, or to Nassau, a Suevian mentioned by the Roman general in his Gallic War. Be these pedigrees accurate or not, it is at least certain that the feudal chiefs of the Lahn Valley, first counts of Lemmenburg, then of Nassau, grew in power and influence from the 11th century onward until, in the 13th, their house supplied in the person of Adolf a successful candidate for the imperial throne. To the aspiring medieval noble, every neighboring province was, first and foremost, a potential dowry, and count after count of Nassau made marriage a means to territorial profit. Otto II, from whom William the Silent was seventh in descent, married the heiress of Vianden. Engelbert I, who flourished during the reign of our Henry IV, married Joanna of Lech, and thus acquired great estates in the Low Countries. Engelbert II, the real victor of Guinagates, and the close companion and friend of Charles the Bold, and afterwards of Maximilian, was thus one of the richest magnates of the Burgundian court. By his military and diplomatic triumphs, he gave the name of Nassau a European reputation. Dying without sons, he left his estates to the children of his brother, John, who had married the heiress of Hesse-Katzenelnbogen. According to family tradition, the Netherland possessions went to Henry, the elder son, a worldly, unscrupulous man, famous for having secured Charles V the imperial crown, whilst those in Germany devolved upon William, known to history as William the Rich. The richness of William the Rich was of the same quality as William the Silent's silence. The father was unusually opulent in but one respect. The son was conspicuously speechless upon a single occasion. The Count, in Motley's words, was only rich in children, of which treasures he had 14. True, the Dillenburg estates contained vineyards and spas, but neither alcoholic nor non-alcoholic beverages produced a revenue sufficient to keep the elder William from continuous pecuniary embarrassment. Fortunately, he was a man of simple tastes and small ambitions, and the load of poverty bore more lightly on him than on another. When, all around him, Catholic and Protestant princes were at each other's throats, when his own belongings were constantly threatened by creditors and relatives, he contrived for nearly a century, though he joined for a while the Smokaldian League, not only to retain his grasp upon his inheritance, but to remain at peace with his neighbors. Even the Hesses, whom he hated, he only attacked in the law courts, a suit with them regarding certain lands constituting his chief diversion for the greater part of his life. His country was a little oasis of quiet amid an empire swept by hot and roaring storms, and his subjects were grateful for it. In religion, as in politics, the two spheres were, it is understood, almost coincident in his day. He steered a sane and temperate course. Broad of mind, he came gradually over to the Lutheran doctrines and instructed his simple subjects in them. His faith meant something. He refused the golden fleece rather than take the Catholic oath. But neither as Catholic nor as Protestant did he use his power to inflict anything that can reasonably be called persecution. Probably much of his wisdom was reflected from his wife. Juliana of Nassau, although not gifted with any exceptional intellectual powers, was a remarkable woman. In 1521, at the age of 15, she married William's ward, Count Philip of Hainault. Philip died in 1529, and the widow wedded the guardian. From girlhood, she had shown a more than common strength of conviction and vigor of character. Her Protestantism was fervent, her Christianity more fervent still. Those of her letters which remain to us speak a passionate love for her husband and children, a fortitude unsurpassed even by that of her iron son, and a profound trust in the purposes of a providence which showered upon her lonelinesses and terrible griefs. After her husband's death, her existence was, to judge by things exterior, one of unrelieved misery. Son after son died in battle for the faith that was theirs and hers. But Juliana's spirit was indomitable. She never lost her calm or self-control, and the nascent Dutch Republic itself owed a debt to the mother who, from her German home, gave its founder consolation in sorrow and hope in depression. If William inherited or caught his mildness and tolerance from his father, it is to his mother's blood, training, and example that we may, if we will, trace his spirituality and his unconquerable courage. The 11 years which followed 1533 were strenuous years for Western Europe. They saw what had at first been a bridgeable cleft in the Catholic Church, broaden and deepen until nothing less miraculous than a miracle could have brought the two faces of the gulf together again. In 1534, the young Calvin published the first edition of his Institutes, and the Anabaptists at Munster enjoyed their brief triumph, preaching doctrines and obeying a code more startlingly heretical than any which had yet shocked the Orthodox world. Next year, one of the two great weapons of the Counter-Reformation was forged when Ignatius Loyola and his little cluster of comrades formed the Society of Jesus. And before the short period was out, the seal of pontifical approval had been given to the other great instrument against heresy, the Inquisition. Charles V was striving to scour the Mediterranean of Barbarossa and his corsairs, waging with Henry VIII as his ally his long and futile struggle with Francis I, and endeavoring vainly, his vision of universal empire before him, to bring the German Protestants back to the fold without having recourse to the arms which would engender permanent bitterness and create divisions perhaps unhealable. But life at Dillenburg was very quiet. Now and then a princely train passed through Nassau's territory and was entertained in a princely style. The castle could house 1,000 guests. William never allowed poverty to limit hospitality, and Juliana was renowned as a hostess. In the main, though, the place was more of a home than a court. Almost every year a child was born. John, William's lifelong friend, came in 1536. Louis, afterwards to dazzle Europe with his chivalrousness, in 1537. Later there were two more sons, Adolphus and Henry. and 9 daughters. The elder children were all small together, and although William was to leave Dillenburg young, links were riveted between them in these early days which no subsequent strain could sever. Juliana educated them herself, teaching them the German language, as far as we know the only one she knew, and soaking them through and through with the religion which was a part of her being. Like Cromwell, she walked with God daily. It is doubtful whether any, even among the earlier Protestants, could have had a more intimate sense of the deity's personality and proximity, and she never took a step or watched one of her sons take one without first having sought, so to phrase it, advice and sustenance from Providence. Under this ineffaceable influence, amid the tranquil surroundings of his birthplace, seeing few persons of his own rank save his family, the magnates who from time to time lodged in the castle, and a few stolid young scions of the neighboring nobility who had been sent to Dillenburg to share in his education, the Nassau heir lived for 11 years. Then a thing happened which snatched him from this secluded domesticity and thrust him into the splendor and unrest of the most brilliant court in Europe, an event without the intervention of which his whole life would probably have flowed along very different channels. In July 1544, William's cousin, René of Orange, was killed at Saint Dizier, bequeathing all his possessions to the boy. This René, son of William's uncle Henry, had inherited not only his father's great Netherland estates, but the Principality of Orange and Avignon, which had belonged to his mother's brother, Philibert. Orange, although only 60 square miles in area and inhabited by a few thousand peasants and small tradesmen, was, nominally, a free sovereignty held, not from emperor or king, but direct from God. Hence it was that although William never visited Orange or even what he might have deemed adequate equivalent, derived any income from it, he, like his predecessor, used the Orange title in preference to those, attractive enough in other respects, of Katzenelnbogen, Vianden, Dietz, Tonnerre, Pontieve, Charnay, Breda, Diest, Warrenton, Arlay, Roseroy, and Chasselbellen. In assenting to the testament under which René had left honors and riches to the young German cousin, Charles V stipulated that William should be brought to Brussels and educated under his own eye, naturally feeling a desire that a child who was to be one of his most powerful subjects should be trained in the way he should go. There were objections to this proposal from the parents' point of view. Juliana was naturally unwilling to part with her firstborn, and both she and her husband knew that a Brussels education would mean a Roman Catholic education. But Protestants at that date had still hopes, albeit vain, of a rapprochement with Rome. This being so, and William the Rich and his wife not lacking worldly wisdom because they were replete with heavenly, the agreement was made. Father and mother are reported to have been partly consoled by a rumor that Mary of Hungary, regent of the Netherlands, was inclining towards the Reformed religion. They let the boy go. The elder William took the younger to Brussels, and after seeing the legal forms of succession through, left him under Mary's charge and turned again home. Brussels, the great walled capital of Brabant, was at that time already in population and importance a rival of Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp. Its inhabitants numbered 100,000. Its industrial guilds were 52, and its palaces, churches, and religious houses could be counted by the score. The activities of the city were enormous, its citizens alert, hard-working, and noisy, its nobles addicted to flamingly luxurious banquets, tournaments, and shows. For 8 years, young William of Orange lived here. Nominally, he was Mary's page, but Charles V, taking a liking to him, he soon became the constant companion and attendant of the emperor. At table, in Charles's private apartment, in the council chamber, and at great functions of state, the curly-haired, brown-eyed page was always to be seen at his master's elbow. The experience was invaluable. While his character was still plastic, his mind adolescently swift to receive impressions, he saw the whole machinery of government and of diplomacy from the inside. The pageants, shows, trappings, all the things which aim and succeed in their aim, at making courts, monarchs, and councils larger than human to plebeian eyes, were for him thus early stripped of all power to delude. He heard the petty recriminations and complainings, watched the commonplace intrigues, and was the object of the quite ordinary loves and hates of men who, to the general public, were not men but demigods. He learnt, and never forgot, that he who would understand affairs must understand human beings. His tact, courtesy, and influence over people whom, in his heart, he really despised, were not the least of the factors which contributed towards his success in later days, and their origin can, in part at all events, be traced to the social education he received at the court of Charles V. Social education was not the only sort of education bestowed on him. Charles was considerably more attentive to the intellectual welfare of his page than to that of his heir. He appointed as the boy's tutor Jerome Perrenot, brother to that Bishop of Arras, who was afterwards to engrave his name upon the tablets of history as Cardinal Granvelle. Perrenot was an assiduous master. Religion and statecraft excepted, languages formed at that time the only important study of well-born youth. So well did Perrenot do his work that before William reached manhood he could, beyond his native German, speak and write with consummate ease Flemish, the tongue of his adopted country, Spanish, which was that of his masters, French, that of his neighbors, and Latin, which was the Volapük of cultured Europe. Catholicism the young prince imbibed in the ordinary way from his surroundings, but there is no reason to believe that he was given a training in controversial theology. It is probable, indeed, that in these callow days neither his own soul nor the universe interested him to any great extent. Even when he became a man of intense spirituality, when daily communion with the Eternal came to be his armor against the slings and arrows of fortune, his actions were dictated more by political, in the broadest sense, considerations than by theological ones. Neither as Roman Catholic, as Lutheran, nor as Calvinist did religion mean to him what it meant to Philip II, to William of Hesse, or to Saint Aldegonde. At 17, sunned by the imperial smile, receiving deference from all around him, meditating on the vast possibilities of his personal future, the question of the relative merits of the old and new dogmas disturbed him but little. Of the incidents of his life between the ages of 11 and 18, we know practically nothing. Could his letters to Dillenburg be found, much light might be thrown upon that period, but time has eaten the whole of his correspondence with the exception of a polite and prosaic little letter written to Granvelle in 1550, the year which saw the issue of an edict, of which more will be said later. This veiled period, however, ended in 1551, and subsequent to that year, the supply of documents of all kinds relating to him is amply abundant. In July 1551, being 18 years old, William married, or rather, was married to, for his own inclinations were of small account in the matter, Anne of Egmont, only child and heiress of Maximilian, Count of Buren, an old general and servant of the emperor. The match was purely an arrangement between Charles and the bride's father. The latter, having been offered a dukedom, asked to have instead William of Orange as a son-in-law. Charles at first had fears lest the marriage should make Orange too powerful, but the Bishop of Arras quashed these scruples. There was no question of demur on the part of either of the two persons who, to the unsophisticated modern mind, would seem to be most nearly concerned. As things turned out, the union proved as satisfactory as most. Anne was intelligent, sympathetic, good-tempered, and as old as her husband, and the letters which passed between them indicate that the marriage to convenance developed into a marriage of affection. 2 children, Philip and Mary, of course, were born of the union. It only lasted 6 years, during the greater part of which husband and wife were separated by war. But had not Anne been torn away by an untimely death, William would, in all likelihood, never have been harried by domestic troubles during the most anxious portion of his political career. Immediately after the wedding, the prince and princess entered into occupation of the magnificent Nassau Palace at Brussels, built, grievous to tell, by Engelbert, with money extorted from the wretched merchants of Bruges. They entertained there on a lavish scale, keeping open house to all comers. Anne's large dowry apart, William was exceedingly rich. But, coming as he did of a stock which was always extravagant in youth, he contrived to make his expenditure considerably exceed his income. The careless, clean-featured young man, proud yet merry and courteous and free of speech and gesture, lived royally, dressed magnificently, and rode through Brussels streets with a crowd of gentlemen attendants, jousted and hunted in state. For years he kept a whole regiment of falconers, and his kitchen was the school for a continent's cooks. Later, debt forced him to retrench, but during Anne's lifetime, the Nassau Palace excelled in hospitality that of the monarch himself. William, however, was for the while destined to see little of the palace. 9 months of banquets and levees, and he found himself in camp. After a year or two of cautious negotiations, the German princes under Maurice of Saxony's leadership had formed with Henry II of France an alliance against the emperor. The grievance of the former being Charles's continual encroachments upon their religious and political liberties, and the object of the latter the humbling of an all-powerful rival and the rectification of the Franco-Netherlandish frontier. The emperor was at Innsbruck when news of the rebellion reached him, and the task of meeting Henry's attack upon the frontier devolved upon the regent Mary. Always energetic, she took prompt steps to organize the Netherland forces and to defend the principal strategic points. William of Orange, who had been captain of foot since his marriage, was amongst the nobles selected for command.